India Boeing 787 crash. According to preliminary verified information, the aircraft took off normally from the runway, smoothly lifting off. However, just a few seconds after becoming airborne, the situation suddenly changed. This Boeing 787 appeared to lose control, completely losing lift. At present, around this core issue, three of the most likely hypotheses are under investigation. It should be noted that the Boeing 787 was once regarded as one of the world's safest and most trustworthy civilian aircraft, with millions of hours of safe flight records. But the crash of Air India Flight 171 ended that record. This is the first total hull loss accident in the history of the Boeing 787 series. Based on videos posted on social media, after a normal liftoff, the plane suddenly lost control. Its nose pitched sharply upward, its tail dropped, and the entire aircraft plunged almost vertically. This is an extremely dangerous form of descent. Many people have begun to question the 787's variable camber wing system. This system is used during the takeoff phase to provide lift. The standard takeoff setting for the Boeing 787's variable camber wing is 5. Specifically, the leading edge slats were fully extended and the trailing edge flaps were deflected downward about 5 degrees. However, the flight path in this accident was very similar to a situation where takeoff occurred without flap deployment. This would be a serious error, and if it really happened, it could stem from human operational mistake or a system malfunction. Another obvious detail is that when the aircraft appeared on camera, its landing gear was still down. This is unusual because under standard procedures, the landing gear should be retracted after the aircraft climbs to about 50 feet above the ground. The plane had already taken off and begun climbing, yet the gear remained extended. This may indicate that the pilots encountered an emergency immediately after liftoff. Another clearly visible point is that both engines were still attached under the wings. There were no flames, no explosions, and no signs of separation, but we cannot determine whether the engines were still functioning at that moment. In the footage, there were no sparks, no smoke, and no obvious jet exhaust trails, something that should have been very visible in daylight. Therefore, many speculate that the aircraft may have suddenly lost power right after takeoff. At such a low altitude, an event like this would leave almost no chance of recovery. This forms the basis of the first hypothesis, a dual-engine failure causing the aircraft to lose thrust and plunge vertically. So what could be the cause of a dual-engine failure? If both engines truly lost power within seconds of takeoff, then the most likely causes can be reduced to two main scenarios. The first, the aircraft flew into a large flock of birds, leading both engines to flame out after foreign object ingestion. The second, fuel contamination, since fuel is the only factor shared between the two engines. Contaminated fuel could trigger a simultaneous flameout. But when compared against the known facts, neither hypothesis seems convincing. First, in the video footage of the crash, there are no signs of birds at all. Not a single one, let alone a flock. And for a bird strike to cause dual engine failure, it would require a very large number of birds to enter both engines at precisely the moment of liftoff, an almost impossible coincidence. Furthermore, the typical after effects of bird ingestion, such as flames, sparks, or black smoke, are completely absent in the footage. Both engines appeared intact in the footage, with no signs of detachment, and they even seemed to still be rotating. Secondly, if the engine failure had been caused by fuel contamination, the problem should have appeared during taxiing or the takeoff roll. When the pilots advanced the throttles, if the fuel had been compromised, the engines would have immediately shown signs such as insufficient thrust, vibrations, or abnormal noises. But in this accident, the aircraft taxied smoothly, successfully reached takeoff speed, and lifted off according to standard procedure. This indicates that if there truly was a loss of power, it happened only after the aircraft had already become airborne, not during the taxi or acceleration phase. Therefore, in the absence of clear evidence, the theories of bird strike or fuel contamination causing dual-engine flameout are not convincing. The second hypothesis is that the flaps were not extended at takeoff. This theory suggests that the Boeing 787 may have attempted takeoff with the flaps not deployed. Such a takeoff without flap extension could explain why the aircraft pitched up after liftoff but quickly stalled and crashed. However, for this to occur, a series of highly unusual errors would have been required. Before takeoff, Boeing 787 pilots must complete 2 sets of electronic checklists, both of which confirm flap settings based on aircraft weight and runway length. Unlike earlier aircraft models that used paper checklists, the Boeing 787 is equipped with an electronic checklist system. If the flaps are not properly set, the system issues a warning during taxi. And when the throttles are advanced for takeoff, the system would inevitably trigger a series of severe alerts. In particular, a red config warning would appear on the central display screen, while the main warning lights in front of both the captain and first officer would simultaneously illuminate. Therefore, if this hypothesis were true, it would mean the crew had deliberately bypassed 2 sets of checklist procedures, ignored all system prompts, and even chosen to proceed with takeoff despite flashing warning lights and blaring alarms. If that were the case, this would not merely be a technical mistake, but a series of serious operational violations, possibly even involving intentional action. The third hypothesis suggests pilot misoperation, that the flaps were retracted instead of the landing gear. According to this theory, the aircraft had the correct flap setting during takeoff, lifted off successfully, and after the command was given to retract the landing gear, the first officer or monitoring pilot mistakenly manipulated the controls and retracted the flaps instead of the gear. If such an error occurred, it could indeed explain why the aircraft suddenly lost lift, descended rapidly, and crashed. This is because, at low speed and high load, with the landing gear still extended, if the flaps are suddenly retracted, all lift generated by the wings would disappear almost instantly. At the same time, the large aerodynamic drag from the extended landing gear would still remain. Under such conditions, the aircraft would be nearly impossible to keep airborne. At that moment, the nose would inevitably drop, not as a result of pilot input, but purely due to aerodynamic reaction. When the system tried to regain lift by adjusting the angle of the airflow, it instead caused the aircraft to shake and rapidly lose altitude. Even more dangerous, the pilots might not have realized that the flaps had already been retracted. The pilots may have just issued the command to retract the landing gear, and when they noticed a slight slowdown or descent during the initial climb, they assumed it was normal. But by the time they truly understood what had happened, it was already too late to recover. This matches exactly with the maneuver seen in the video and is consistent with aerodynamic logic. Therefore, at one point, this was considered the most likely cause, until new evidence emerged, shifting attention toward an even more serious possibility. Recently, a new hypothesis surfaced based on an unreleased original video. Unlike the low-resolution clips previously circulating on phones or screens, this one was high-quality footage. It prompted the aviation community to reevaluate the crash of Air India Flight 171. In this clear video, aviation analysts quickly noticed a critical detail. The emergency ram air turbine had already deployed from the underside of the aircraft. This is one of the strongest pieces of evidence suggesting that shortly after takeoff, the aircraft may have completely lost its main power systems. The ram air turbine is a small propeller device that only deploys automatically in extremely severe emergencies. When both engines completely fail, the main electrical and hydraulic systems collapse, and the auxiliary power unit cannot be started. The ram air turbine will automatically extend from the underside of the Boeing 787. Its purpose is to provide the minimum amount of electrical and hydraulic support, allowing pilots to retain the most basic flight controls. But its function is far from enough to maintain normal flight. Once deployed, the Ram air turbine spins rapidly in the oncoming wind, producing a sharp, high-pitched whistle similar to that of a small propeller engine. In this original video, that sound is very distinct, and the footage confirms that the Ram air turbine had already deployed. But here lies the problem. The Ram air turbine cannot save the aircraft if lift is lost at low altitude. If the aircraft loses engine power at around 400 to 500 feet, even with the Ram air turbine deployed, it would be impossible to recover. The failure occurred so suddenly that there was no time to restart any of the systems. In addition, this completely matches the testimony of the only survivor. The survivor heard a loud bang, after which the cabin lights began to flicker. This is a typical sign of a complete collapse of the electrical system. Combining all the evidence, the most reasonable and credible hypothesis can be drawn. Right after takeoff, both engines shut down simultaneously, leading to the total loss of thrust, electrical, and hydraulic systems. The aircraft instantly entered an uncontrollable state and crashed. At present, 4 confirmed pieces of evidence support the assumption of dual engine failure. The Ram air turbine had already deployed, clearly captured in the video. The unique high-frequency propeller sound of the Ram air turbine was clearly recorded in the audio. The sole survivor heard a loud bang, followed by flickering cabin lights, a typical symptom of electrical system paralysis. The aircraft sent out an emergency distress signal, confirming insufficient power to maintain altitude. Now the question becomes, what reason could cause both engines to shut down at the same moment? For modern jet engines, there are only 2 factors that can lead to such catastrophic consequences: air and fuel. The operation of a jet engine is a stable process. It inhales air, compresses it, mixes it with liquid fuel, ignites, and produces thrust. If any step in this cycle is interrupted, the engine will lose power. The probability of both engines failing at the same time is extremely rare. The design standard of the Boeing 787 is that even if only one engine remains functional, whether at full load, with the landing gear not retracted, or under severe weather conditions, the aircraft can still fly safely. If it were only a single engine failure, the plane could have continued flying, and this incident would not have escalated into a globally noted aviation tragedy. In the crash video, it can be clearly seen that the landing gear was never retracted. This indicates the plane never climbed to a safe altitude. This further confirms one conclusion. Dual engine failure occurred almost immediately after the aircraft left the ground. Some have suggested that the deployment of the Ram air turbine may have been triggered by electrical or hydraulic system failures. This is indeed possible on the Boeing 787. But the key point is that these system failures would not directly cause engine flameout. Therefore, we must once again focus on those 2 core factors, air and fuel. This leads to a hypothesis, compressor stall. It is a phenomenon of airflow instability inside the engine, which can cause violent vibrations and produce sounds similar to loud bangs, much like a car engine backfiring. However, in the case of Air India Flight 171, there were no reports of explosions, fire, or abnormal noises. Moreover, compressor stall rarely leads to a complete engine shutdown. Therefore, this is not the most likely cause. Now let's look at fuel as a factor. The loss of engine power could be due to an interruption of fuel supply. This again falls into 3 possibilities. The pilot manually shut off the fuel. This action is a routine step when taxiing back to the apron, but it makes no sense during takeoff. No pilot would manually cut off fuel at such a critical moment as takeoff. Thus, this hypothesis can be ruled out. The other 2 possibilities that must be taken seriously are fuel contamination and vapor lock. Fuel contamination refers to water, impurities, sediments, or other pollutants entering the fuel system, clogging the filters, preventing fuel from reaching the engine, and causing flameout. Since both engines share the same fuel supply system, once the fuel source is contaminated, it could indeed lead to a simultaneous dual-engine failure. But here lies the problem. At a modern international airport like Ahmedabad, fuel is not delivered by simple tanker trucks, but through a complex underground pipeline network. This system includes multiple filtration layers and real-time monitoring sensors. If contamination occurs, the system itself would interrupt the process before refueling even begins. More importantly, if the fuel were truly contaminated, abnormalities should have appeared much earlier, during engine start, taxiing, or acceleration. For example, insufficient thrust, irregular noises, and so on. Yet in this incident, the aircraft operated normally right up until it was fully airborne. Therefore, although fuel contamination is technically possible, it remains doubtful in this case. The final possibility is vapor lock, and contrary to popular belief, vapor lock does not only affect piston engines or carbureted engines. Its core issue is not the engine type, but rather the properties of the fuel itself. When fuel is overheated before entering the combustion chamber, it can vaporize prematurely and form bubbles. These bubbles obstruct the flow of fuel, ultimately causing the engine to flame out. It is worth noting that on Air India Flight 171, all the conditions required for vapor lock were present: a hot environment, the aircraft exposed on the ground under intense heat, prolonged engine operation at idle before takeoff, high power demand during the takeoff roll. When these factors combine, they can raise the temperature of fuel in the lines to a critical threshold, causing vapor bubbles to form, triggering vapor lock, and leading to a near-immediate dual-engine flameout just after liftoff, the most vulnerable phase of flight. This is a fatal failure mode that the aviation community has seriously underestimated, yet one that is technically entirely possible. In summary, after ruling out other possibilities, the two serious remaining hypotheses are fuel contamination and vapor lock. Although the probability of both scenarios is extremely low, in an event where all variables defy convention, sometimes the least likely explanation turns out to be the truth. In aviation, the root of many accidents can often be a tiny operational mistake, a lapse during refueling, or an unexpected change in weather conditions. Any factor that appears insignificant can potentially trigger a disaster. This is exactly why, in aviation safety investigations, every possibility, no matter how inconceivable, must be thoroughly examined. As of now, the official cause of Air India Flight 171's accident has still not been definitively determined.